On with gameplay. This is the opening setup for Gettysburg, the first day. It can be a little distracting, but these markers here with the flags are control markers and objective hexes. So this shows the objective hex, and you flip it over, you demonstrate control of it. So the blue ones, of course, are federal objectives, and the gray ones are Confederate objectives. So once they achieve the hex, you'd flip it over, and then they'd be awarded, the victory points for having controlled it. The only units to begin on the map are the Federal Cavalry. This would be Buford's division, 2 brigades plus some artillery. You have the choice to start them mounted or dismounted. For the life of me, I can't figure out why I would ever dismount cavalry. Based on the rules and what little play I've had experimenting, I don't see the advantage to dismounting in any way, and you have pretty good advantages remaining mounted in terms of being able to retreat out of harm's way pretty effectively. In other words, I don't see any better staying power when you're dismounted, and you're reduced in strength when you're dismounted, so I don't know why you want to do that. Maybe longer term play will reveal that. So I'm going to start them mounted because I want them to be a screen when the rebels arrive. I suppose that's the best way to do it. The balance of the forces for this scenario are placed here on the hour track, indicating when they arrive as reinforcements. So the first reinforcements are going to be for 1st Corps and East Division, of course. Notice that the cavalry, Pleasanton's cavalry movement chit, is there on the 2nd hour, meaning that cavalry, the Federal cavalry that's set up on the map, actually can't move this hour. And there's the draw cup with the chits in it. See 2 move chits, one for the Federals and one for the Confederates, representing those 2 reinforcements that are going to arrive. There's also 2 combat chits, because no one starts with initiative, therefore both chits will go in the cup and combat will be drawn randomly. And for clarity, I've removed all the unnecessary objective markers, left only those that are relevant for this scenario. So the Confederates have to get all the way to Cemetery Ridge and Culp's Hill. The Federal, and combined with lost victory points, the Federals, along with lost victory points, can win if they either hold their own objective hexes or deny the Confederates theirs, while keeping an advantage in lost victory points. So let's get started with the first hour. Seen our cup, so we'll pull our first chit. So this is perfect. Our first chit pull is the Federal combat turn. No one is in contact. There's no enemy on the map, so no combat. The second chit pull is for Reynolds. So the 1st Division that is arriving, 2 brigades, will now get to move. And there they are. They arrived at entry hex A. They moved along the road. 1 movement point per hex, so they're able to reach that spot. Next chit is Heath. He has 2 brigades arriving, so we'll move them on. They arrive at entry hex B. Again, moving along the road, they use their full movement allowance. Move to that position. And because the Federal combat turn was already pulled, they were safe to move up onto the ridge here, even in the face of that Federal artillery, because that horse artillery is not going to have a chance to bombard them. Which leaves the last chit as the combat turn. Again, no one's in contact, so there's not going to be any firing. And that will be the last activity of this hour. We'll just move on to the next. Kind of boring, but at least we saw a little bit of the mechanics of play. I think I'll go ahead and move some forces around and get them into contact so we can see a real combat turn. Hour, I should say. So we'll pick it up on hour 3 here. Nothing of movement so far, as the Federal 1st Corps is arriving, and Heath's division is assembling, but otherwise no one has engaged in any combat. But the contents of the chit cup is growing, so maybe we'll get some stuff happening this turn. First chit is Confederate combat. To drag, they have no one in contact, so no combat. And the second is Heath's division. So now we're going to have a choice to make here. Here's Heath's 4 brigades. That is part of the artillery reserve. It cannot move with this movement turn. And it's opposed by the Federal cavalry there. Now they've already had their combat turn. So it means they can't initiate combat. But they can possibly, instigate some combat, or at least some choices for the Federals by moving adjacent to Buford's division there. So I think that's what we'll do. We'll try to pull them out into a combat. So that's 3 movement points, 4, 5, 6, 7 to get to that hex. I think we'll move Davis right to there. Pettigrew will move 2 down the road, 1 for the stream, 2 for the clear, and 2 more to get adjacent to Devon's brigade. I think we'll kind of move Brockenborough right there. Now, not quite done. I have to show all these as moving for approach fire, because the Federals still have their combat turn waiting out there. So the question is, who do I call this approach fire against, That's easy. Both of them are moving against that unit. Do I have to approach the artillery? I'm still fuzzy on how those kind of things work out. But I think that's the way I would do it. And that will conclude that movement turn. We'll pick another one from the cup. Howard's 11th Corps reinforcement will arrive, so we'll move them. And here they arrived at Hex H, moved up the Taneytown Road. Now notice that the artillery is behind the infantry. They describe this as reinforcements arriving in conga line, basically meaning they pay the movement costs that would be occurring off map. So they arrive, not with full movement when they reach this hex. They've already expended something to get here. You just end up paying the cost of the units that went before. So our artillery with 1 fewer movement point ends up 1 hex behind. And the next shit is the Federal cavalry. So there they are, occupying their position on the ridge. They do have a combat turn coming to them, they know. They have an opportunity to fire first with that approach fire. But the question is, are they strong enough to do any damage without taking too much damage themselves? And the combat situations chart here on the player aid probably answers that. Cavalry versus infantry has a -1 to hit. So each of those situations has 1 brigade versus 2. They have -1 to hit. I kind of don't like those odds. But do they need to hold that position? The 1st Corps lead elements are here. They have a movement turn coming, but we know the furthest they can get is right here. Maybe that's far enough. Maybe the cavalry can disengage, move out of that ZOC, get back a bit, screen if they have to, and give the 1st Corps a chance to assemble on Seminary Ridge. So I think that's going to be our choice. We're going to move and get away. So we disengaged here, moved back a couple hexes, still maintaining a bit of a screen, but we're not going to be able to engage in any combat when our combat turn is pulled. Next hit is the 1st Corps, so we'll move those units up. Most of the 1st Corps is still advancing up. Emmetsburg Road, Wadsworth's division here is getting into place, and 1 lone brigade of the 3rd Division. I think that's Doubleday. He's coming up. And there's only 2 turns left. Federal combat and then the movement of the Rebel Artillery Reserve. So no one is in contact, and the artillery is actually in a depression here. Left them in a low ground, that's high ground. So the Federal or the rebel units are behind that ridge line, so no artillery fire is possible. With the last hit, the Confederates will move that artillery reserve unit right up there on top of the ridge. Get them ready to bombard next turn. So that's it for this hour. Let's try to get ourselves into position to actually get some combat going. It's hour 4. This is the way the chits have drawn. Lots of movement, and now finally a combat. It'll be Confederate combat. Not a lot of contact going on, but a couple of brigades of Heath's division are here against Biddle's brigade, and then Pegram's artillery is in range of some Federals, so we can get some artillery bombardment going. Step 2 of the combat sequence is artillery bombardment. So we have Pegram's unit here. He has a choice of targets. I think everybody here is in the woods, so that's going to be a negative modifier. This guy's actually down below slope, so he's out of sight. So we're going to go ahead and fire him on Cutler's brigade there. This is just a fire attack, so we'll figure our 2-hit number and roll 5 dice to see if we get any hits. Or not. The range modifier for 3 hexes is -4. The hit number for woods is 3, so I can't possibly get a hit. So we'll just skip on to approach fire. So here we have 1 unit being approached by 2 units. So he will have to split his fire between the 2 units. It's going to be kind of hard to get any hits on them. They are moving, so that's a negative modifier, but this guy is on higher ground, which confers no advantage in attacking, but will and when he's the target of fire. So these are both in clear terrain. That'll be a hit number of 5. And 0 from around, -3 for approach, so that'll be a 2 for our hit. And we can fire, I think we'll fire 3 strength points here, and 2 at that one. So we managed 1 hit on Davis. That'll be the end of the fire. And then we'll do our hit resolution here, which is a morale check. We rolled a 9, which will be a pass, and therefore that hit will become a demoralization. So we have 7 strength points effective in Davis's brigade. And that will be approach fire. We'll determine our engagements. There's only the one, these 2 brigades and that one. Now we'll resolve our fire simultaneously. Similar to before, we're going to split and fire 3 strength points here and 2 there. And these will be able to fire their full number at him, at Biddle. Each of these will have a 4 for the 2 hit. He's in clear terrain but on higher ground. And both of these will be 5 2-hit numbers. Okay, kids, don't get caught alone on the firing line. Biddle managed 1 hit on Archer, none on Davis. And this mass of strength ended up being 7 and 4, so 11 die rolls yielded 7 hits. That's pretty rough. This guy's going to get busted up no matter what. So now we'll do our hit resolution, which are morale checks for each of the 2 hit units. Archer passes, so he takes 1 demoralization for that hit, and Biddle failed, so he takes 1 strength point loss, and the other remaining can just wipe him out completely as demoralization. So he'll be shattered, and he's been removed completely. He'll have 4 strength points left, and he'll have 4 strength points, and then 4 demoralizations. 3. Am I doing my math right? No, he'll have 4 and 4 to show he has nothing left. I think that's how they want you to mark it. So Biddle is shattered. He'll be removed from the board and put in the shattered box on the side here. And that will conclude that round. The Confederates are the attackers, so they can advance after combat. So we'll move David up onto the ridge. Since there's no one left in contact in that engagement, there's no second round, and I think we're done. We're done. There are no other engagements. We're done with our combat turn. The last two chits are the Federal combat, which none of the infantry forces were in contact, so we had the one horse artillery to take a pot shot to no effect, and then the artillery reserve was able to move. And that really constitutes 2 units at this point, 1 reinforcement and Pilgrims that was on the ridge there. Last in the cup means the end of this hour. We would just switch to the next hour and then start the cup fresh. And that's why meeting engagement battles are so great for learning a system. You have a small number of forces, they slowly gather. You can try out different things a bit at a time and not be overwhelmed by a gigantic engagement across entire 2 armies grappling. So we've kind of done everything there is to do. We pulled our chits, we moved, we had some approach fire, we had some standard combat, saw some losses, saw how dangerous it is to get trapped in a firefight with superior forces. And now I'm going to play the rest of the scenario, and I'll recap on the final turn, see who won, and kind of describe how it played out. And this is the final position at the 11th hour turn, the end of the first day scenario at Gettysburg. See, the Confederates got pretty far. I'm going to go down for a closer look here. Most of the victory locations were on the north side here. Culp's Hill down through the Cemetery Ridge. And the Confederates managed a substantial victory. It's 1 level down from decisive, because they were able to control 4 objective hexes. They almost had this one here. They were really never threatening the southern end of the ridge there. And at one point, Early's division did capture Culp's Hill here, but then the 12th Corps was able to push them back. Now it is hard to see because these are stacked up, but many units have taken very, very serious losses. The Iron Brigade is down to 1 strength point. Many brigades on the Confederate side are down to 2 or 1 effective strength points, a combination of losses and demoralizations. Here's a good example, 4 demoralizations on Wainwright's artillery there. Most of the 1st Corps has taken pretty substantial losses. Basically, anyone on the board who was engaged took substantial losses. For the Union, these are the shattered units, the units that have no more effective strength points, or intact, I guess is the term of art for this game. So the entirety of the 11th Corps is gone. About half of the 1st Corps, and maybe a third of the 12th Corps. Those are all the formations that were engaged. When the horse artillery for the Buford's division is wiped out there. For the Confederates, similar carnage. Fewer units, but fully half of each division, more so for Heath here, is currently completely ineffective, shattered off the board. Now the scenario ends with the 11th hour, but if they were to continue for the second day into the night turns, we would have an opportunity to rally some of those eliminated units, shattered units, as well as just losses for demoralizations on the board. So it would get some strength back. Now, total losses for the Confederates for this first day are 65 demoralized strength points and 19 permanently lost strength points. That is a lot of casualties. Let's look at the numbers for the Union. And here are the numbers for the Federal side. 62 demoralized strength points and 15 permanent lost strength points. So very similar losses between both sides. Now at the scale of the game, at 300 men per strength point, that's going to work out to 5,700 permanent losses for the Confederates and 4,500 permanent losses for the Federals. That seems about right. It's these demoralized losses that look so staggering. That's approximately 19,500 demoralized or permanent, temporary, I guess I should say, losses for the Confederates, and 18,600 temporary losses for the Federals. But those demoralized losses really are kind of semi-permanent. Each unit gets a chance to rally during the night turns only. And the typical average unit, with average morale like +1 and lower, can retrieve or recover 1 demoralized strength point per turn. So maybe 2 per day. That's not a lot. Obviously, the better morale units can recover more. But still, you're looking at maybe a best case of recovering a third, maybe less of your demoralized strength points in a day. So to a great extent, those strength points aren't coming back either. I think the intent of this game can be expressed as fast, bloody, and not too complicated. As for speed of play, I'd say it falls somewhere in the middle. It's both fast and slow. The chit draw mechanism is fairly straightforward, along with movement, but the number of chits can really grow, especially in a large game like Gettysburg, as the forces concentrate. This is the chit cup at the end of the first day. That's more than a fair number of chits there. And that's not even all coming in the rest of the game. There's 7 more that will arrive on the second day. So after a while, you're pulling a lot of chits to complete an hour. Move turns progress fairly quickly. That's largely a factor of the scale, size of the map, but also the size of the units involved. Any particular move turn is going to have anywhere from 4 to maybe 7 counters making up that turn, so moving those isn't too bad. It goes pretty quickly. I'd say there's only really one thing that intervenes, and that's the pause and ponder effect. As you draw a chit and move, and then your opponent draws a chit, counter moves, you kind of sometimes need to stop and think, well, what's my best move now? Now that the map has changed, what can I do with my forces? And that slows down a little bit. One thing about the chit draw, it didn't really yield the ebb and flow effect I was expecting. It was more like forces slamming together for a combat than the kind of attack-counterattack vibe I was expecting. Now, the combat turn is where things kind of start to slow down. It's not that the combat itself is difficult, it's just that there's so much of it and it's very repetitive. Every combat involves a whole lot of dice and a whole lot of markers. The very process of rolling 1 die for every strength point and then applying the fire resolution for the hits. Then after that, rolling for morale to resolve the hits into strength losses or demoralizations. Just a lot of dice rolling, marking, removing a marker, placing new markers in place. Then the second round comes along and you're going to do the same thing again. Mark hits, then remove those markers and put new markers in place. So a lot of back and forth with markers to resolve combats. And eventually, when the forces come together, there's so many, it just kind of causes that turn to more or less come to a stop. I read the sequence as being pretty literal. Resolve all fires to produce hits. That could be hits along both sides. And then resolve all hits into outcomes for the defenders first, and then for the attackers next. So even though there might be techniques for rolling a morale die at the same time as fire, that just seems to fly in the face of the explicit sequence that's laid out in the rules. But there's absolutely no question about the bloody part. Many, many hits are generated when combat is engaged. All of those result in something, either permanent or semi-permanent demoralization losses, and they pile up quick. the designer's perspective is that combats at this era and this scale would resolve within an hour. I think you definitely see that in the game. The hits pile up very quickly. Those are going to always result in some sort of diminishing strength of the unit, and sometimes you can see units wiped out in one single combat and removed from the map, shattered and completely ineffective. At the slow rate of return of demoralized strength points, that means really much of the army will be whittled away very quickly. The effect of that does seem kind of on target. I mean, it's within the scope of the system. But one of the strange things that will happen in a large game is that as units are shattered, demoralized, removed from the map, you end up with very few forces facing off and even fewer that are capable of actually fighting. So it just sort of looks funny. You don't seem to see any armies on the field, but you just sort of have to use your intuition to know that the forces that are shattered are actually still here. You know, the men are there. They just aren't able to, affect any real attack or defense in games terms. So they might be there, but they're not really affecting the game anymore. And I do think the not too complex part is on the mark as well. For the most part, these systems are pretty straightforward. There are a couple of things I find a little fiddly, like the approach fires and fire masking. Those, they take some attention, and the effect is not that pronounced, especially when you compare it to the kind of cataclysmic casualties from standard combat. Sometimes I just feel like I want to roll the dice, shoot, and get on with it, and forget about those little nuance effects. Another area that requires some effort, but the effect is not all that pronounced, is the managing of engagements. I think the intent is clear, to try to make sections of the field resolve combats independently, and then possibly, gain advantages. But because of the sort of the nature of advances and retreats, things can just sort of glom together, and then it's hard to keep track of, well, which units were in engagement 1 and which were in engagement 2, and am I supposed to fight this guy or not? So short of using some extra markers like this, I don't know how best to go about keeping the engagements separated and resolved independently. But the only real bit of complexity, I think, is maybe unwarranted. Not even maybe, definitely. Is cavalry. I don't get the point of the rules surrounding mounting versus dismounting. They have extra counters to show dismounted status, horses, horse holders, where they are in relation to the dismounted unit, and yet I just don't see any effects to justify that. There's no particular advantage to being dismounted, no disadvantage to being mounted. The unit behaves the same, except with fewer strength points and these horses hanging around. So why ever dismount? My feeling is fight mounted, use your better mobility, your ability to screen. You're no worse off, and forget the rest of it. Overall, with my stated goal of trying to find less complex ACW games, at the brigade scale like this, I'd say this one fits the bill pretty well.